Welcome! Today I'm going to be pulling back the curtain on junk science, particularly the junk science of Tony Heller, or is it Stephen Goddard? Maybe it's Tony Goddard, or perhaps Stephen Heller, whatever name he's going by today. Well, let's see what Heller says and where the truth lies. His major claim is that NASA and NOAA are destroying science by data tampering. I was challenged to debunk this particular video, which was called This Truth, by one of Rod Martin's fans and obviously a Stephen Heller fan. So let's see what he has to say and what, if any of it, is true. Spoiler alert, none of it's true. Heller starts off by a trip down memory lane by dredging up an old article from Time magazine reprinted in a local newspaper in 1947. There was a claim that global warming was likely. Note, at this time, neither NASA nor NOAA existed. NASA wasn't founded until 1958 and NOAA wasn't founded until 1970. So it had been very hard for them to have a hand in pushing this article. Here's a copy of that article, and one thing you should note, this is about a statement by a single scientist, Professor Hans Ullmann, a professor of geography, note not meteorology or climatology, saying that the Earth is warming. Now in science, a statement by a single scientist is not taken with very much weight. You have to wait until there's been several other scientists who have verified the results of that paper or that statement. It also says in that same article that scientists do not agree about the causes of the fluctuations in climate. So it's not exactly a definitive article, and trying to draw conclusions from something like this is a fool's errand. We've all seen examples where newspapers and magazines have got science completely wrong. There was this announcement about cold fusion which came out in the newspapers long before there was a paper about it, and when the scientists looked into this they found that it wasn't valid. There was the Korean scientist who claimed to have done cloning, but when other scientists looked into his work they found that it was a fraud. So this shows the danger of taking information from magazines, newspapers, TV and radio and drawing major conclusions about science from it. You need to go back to the original papers and talk to the original authors before you can really do anything substantial like that. And clearly Heller is not doing this. Next, Heller goes to 1974 when Time magazine was apparently pushing another ice age. But if you look at the article, it's very tentative. Another ice age ? A growing number of scientists, that might be from 1 to 2. A growing number of scientists are beginning to suspect that something may be going on. All very tentative and nothing you can build a major case out of, which is what Heller is trying to do. Further down, like the 1947 article, it says that the scientists are unable to provide a satisfactory explanation for all these changes. Later yet again, they say man may be to blame for putting so much dust and particles in the atmosphere. Now these dust and particles are what we now call aerosols, and they do have a cooling effect on the planet. Now in the mid-70s we passed Clean Air Acts which removed much of the dust and particles from the atmosphere, and the carbon dioxide increase started to take effect and temperatures went up. Also, scientists back then were saying that this cooling trend may be only temporary, and they in fact were right. So on these last two items the scientists were dead on. So what was everybody looking at to be drawing all these major conclusions? Here's the global temperature plot over the last 140 years. And this is the period that we're discussing. Now in 1947 you could be quite forgiven for believing there's a warming trend going on, because since 1900 there had been about 0.4 degrees centigrade warming of the planet as a whole. For the next 30 to 40 years that temperature rise leveled off. So let's take a look at that area in detail, and if you take the dates that Heller used, 1947 to 1974, you can see there's actually a slight warming trend throughout that period. Equally, if I went back a bit further or went forward a bit further, I could get a completely flat trend, and there are dates I could choose here that would give me slightly negative trends. But the point here is they're all very small and probably insignificant. What is happening is that the balance between the warming from greenhouse gases and the cooling from the aerosols is about equal, and so therefore the global temperatures stalled out. It wasn't until the Clean Air Act came into being, and that started to remove the aerosols from the atmosphere, that the global warming trend from the greenhouse gases started to dominate, and global temperatures started to go back up again round about 1980 or so. Heller then goes on to make the classic mistake of believing his own propaganda and drawing conclusions from it. He states that in the past, Vikings used to graze sheep on Greenland, but now it's too cold for sheep in Greenland. So I decided to check the current Greenland agriculture. One of their primary products is sheep. They also grow potatoes, 3 different varieties: beets, carrots and turnips, lettuce, kale, cabbages, cauliflower, spinach and herbs, onions, rhubarb and celery, and even strawberries. Heller would be very well served if he actually checked his facts before making rash statements like this. Now we come to what I call the Reykjavik deception. Heller for some reason becomes fixated on Reykjavik, a small town on the southwest coast of Iceland and its capital. He shows a temperature plot for Reykjavik, here in blue, and on that plot he marks the times of the 3 Time articles about global climate: the 1947 global warming, the 1974 global cooling, and the 2007 global warming articles. Now he makes the point that these were all written at times of extreme changes in global temperatures, so trying to push the science by using extremes. However, the problem is he gets the times wrong. I very carefully calculated where 1947, 1974 and 2007 are on this plot and marked them with a vertical red line. So his 3 circles should be here, here and here. Nothing like the circles he shows. In fact, the 1947 global warming article was written at one of the lowest temperatures on this plot. The 1974 global cooling article was written at a local peak of temperatures, and the 2007 global warming article was written after a peak of global temperatures and the temperatures were coming back down. So this is a deception. Here's another deception. He shows this picture. He shows the measured plot and also the so-called reported data. Now you'll see that the reported data is not actually the final data. That is the homogenized data. That's the one you want, and that's what we should be looking at. So what are these 3 different types of data? So the unadjusted data is the raw station data. The adjusted data allows for changes in the station over a period like 100 years or more. You're not going to be using the same equipment. The way that it's recorded may be different, and the station may not even be in the same place. So when you make a change like that, what you do is you take data both sites with both sets of equipment and compare them, and if there's an offset between them, you make that adjustment to the data. Cleaned means you get rid of bad data. Why would you want to include bad data points in your analysis? It just distorts the result. And homogenized data allows for the fact that this data has been taken in Reykjavik, which is a large town and therefore has its own small climate, so-called urban heat island effect, and you need to take that into account. So it's the homogenized data we should be looking at. What does that look like? Here it is, and you can see it's much warmer in the old times than it is the original data shown here in pink. So these adjustments are altogether scientifically valid, and to try to pretend that they're otherwise is again deception. I don't care the remotest bit about what some journalist seems to think that some scientist said, when that journalist has probably not spent a minute of his life inside a scientific lab. The way to find out what the scientific community was saying back then is to read the papers they wrote. Between 1965 and 1979 there were over 70 papers written about global climate. Of those, 44 were about global warming, whereas 7 were about global cooling, and several of those were about long-term global cooling, as in Milankovitch cycles. There were 20 papers that went neither one way or the other. So in that time frame, over 60% of the papers written by scientists were about global warming, and only less than 10% about global cooling. So for Heller to characterize the scientific community as oscillating between global cooling and global warming is a misrepresentation of the facts, and deceptive on his part. Next, he makes the bold claim that he can invalidate all of global warming theory with just the Reykjavik temperatures. Here he shows the temperatures in blue and overlays the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation on top of it in red. And as you can see, the two match very well. So he claims as the multi-decadal oscillation is due to changes in ocean currents, you can explain all of climate change around the globe with ocean currents. You don't need carbon dioxide or any of the other greenhouse gases or aerosols. Now that doesn't follow scientifically, And we all know that correlation does not indicate causation. But let's take a look at it in a little bit more detail and see where the flaws in his argument lay. Well, what exactly is the AMO? It's simply a temperature difference. It's the sea surface temperature of the northern Atlantic from the equator to about 80 degrees north, minus the average sea surface temperature over the rest of the globe from minus 60 degrees south to plus 60 degrees north. So it's a measure of the difference in temperature in that little square that's above the black line and below the white line. And guess exactly where Iceland is in this picture. Right there. And so therefore it's obvious why the Reykjavik temperatures are going to reflect the AMO, because they're right in the middle of the zone that's most affected by the AMO. In fact, it's probably the one site on Earth which is the most affected by the AMO. Which of course is why Heller chose it. Do you remember this plot where he compared the multi-decadal oscillation to the Reykjavik temperatures and showed a good correlation? Well, there's one slight problem with it. If you look at the range of temperatures for Reykjavik scale and the one for the AMO, you'll see that they're very, very different in scale. The range for the Reykjavik temperatures is 3 degrees centigrade, where the range for the AMO is 0.5 degrees centigrade. So to make them look alike, he's had to magnify them by over a factor of 6. So yet another deception. So who has really been discredited here? Certainly not science. Science has a method of getting closer and closer to the facts by a series of checks and balances. NASA and NOAA have followed those processes and taken the data, analyzed it, written it up, published it through a peer review process, and is now out there for others to criticize. Now, Heller has chosen not to try to criticize it in that forum, but to try to legislate it in the court of public opinion. Perhaps the journalists at some of these magazines are to blame for trying to sensationalize things that they know very little about and thus misreporting them. Most newspapers, magazines, radio and TV stations don't have a scientist on their staff, so don't understand really the subtleties of what's being said. So they misreport it and lead to inaccurate articles in their journals. I've had bitter experience with this over many years, so I'm now very reluctant to talk to reporters. The person I would say that was discredited most by this video was Tony Heller himself. He's been found to be misinformed, deceptive, and possibly even deliberately lying. One wonders in cases like this, if someone has such a strong case, why they have to resort to such tactics to try to make that case. To the person that asked me to review this truth, I have one thing to say: be careful what you ask for. Until next time, goodbye.